everybody, it is Professor Parish, and welcome to English 122, Week 8. I just wanted to start this week off by saying that we are officially near the halfway point in the class. If you count finals week and Thanksgiving break, then between week 8 and 9 is actually midterm, but I'm going to go ahead and call week 8 midterm because many of your professors probably are as well. Now, we don't have a midterm exam, so thumbs up on that, right? Instead, what we do towards midterm is I do a grammar checkup with you all, which I will go over here shortly, and then in the next week we'll have our poetry exam, and we'll actually be tying up poetry. So, going through it already, this semester is flying by. As always, before we start, if you have any questions about any of the content, material, accessing things on our page, please don't hesitate to email and ask. I'm in and out of my office, but if you email me and you want to set up a time to come and review any of the assignments, I'm happy to do so. You can call, leave me a voicemail, or you can always email me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So I'm a little more frequent with checking my email throughout the week than I am on the weekend, but I will make every attempt to answer your questions in a timely fashion. So with that being said, week 8, what is there to talk about? Well, let me go ahead and minimize this, and we will start talking about week 8. So if I go to my course content, I'm going to assume the student status so that I'm viewing it exactly like you all are. Yay, rah. And for this week, we actually don't have a whole lot to do this week in terms of assignments. If you are looking at week 8, you will note there is no discussion forum this week. We only have 15 discussion forums, so we will have a couple of weeks when we don't have one. This midterm week is exactly that. So instead, all you have are 2 assignments that are listed below. Now, I am going to be going over one more thing this week, but I'll tell you all about that at the end of the video, so stick around for that. But we only have 2 assignments this week, and that is the grammar checkup and the reading response number 3. Now, I am going to go over today chapters 16 through 18 about symbol, words, and form from our poetry section, so please stick around and watch that. And then, otherwise, you only have 2 assignments that are due by Sunday. We have no assignments due Friday this week. Woo! Everything is due by Sunday. Of course, if you do submit it during the week, I will try to grade it ahead of time, but if not, I will be grading on Sunday. So, one thing to note before I dive into our assignments, if you are choosing to revise paper 1, again, this is entirely optional. You do not have to revise if you don't want to, but if you do decide to revise, those revisions are due by Monday night on October 7th. So if you received an A or a B on your first paper, I wouldn't say you have to revise. You should be okay. If you received less than a B on paper 1, I would advise you to revise because those are free points that you can make up. And I have discussed how to revise in some previous lecture videos, so please feel free to go back and watch those. I think week 5 I talked about how to revise. You might go back and check that one. But let's talk about this week's assignments. So the first thing that we have up is the grammar checkup drop box. So this is just, and I've already pulled the document up here to show you, all this is a basic review of grammar. So we don't do a lot of grammar in 122 because I assume at this point you have a good grasp on grammar. If there are little nuanced mistakes like with commas or capitalization, I'm going to point those out in the discussion forum via your grade, or I'm going to point it out in the actual paper. And so far, I've not noticed anything too dramatic in terms of grammar that we need to focus on, but this is just a way to check up on everybody. So there's a section about apostrophes. You can choose which one you think is best. So when you find the word that you want, you can just double click it, like I've done with when here, and select this little highlight button, and it will highlight in the color that you want. And so you can highlight whatever answer you think there is to that question. The second part is quotation marks. Please note that you're adding quotation marks and punctuation. So I'll go ahead, since you're watching this video, I'll be able to know if you watched it or not. I'll do the first one with you. So I said, Courtney followed her to the car and told him, wait, don't go yet. Now this capitalized letter is probably going to give it away for most of you all, but what I'm going to do is put a comma, because that starts my dialogue, then my quotation mark, a period, and another quotation mark. And that's all I needed to do for that question. So you're just putting in the punctuation where it goes and the quotation marks where they go. And that's pretty much it. Part 3 is just semicolon and comma reviews. So you put either a semicolon or a comma wherever it's appropriate. Should be pretty easy. And then this last part is a little bit different than the grammar sampler we did at the beginning. What I would like you to do is write out the formula for how to cite a book in MLA and how to do a web page. And I'm going to talk to you all at the end of this video about something that's going to help with this, so just stick around for that. And then the last 5 here, I would like for you to tell me what the in-text citation would be for the sentence, or what type it would be. So if it's a book with one author and the author is not listed in the sentence, then my citation for in-text would be their last name. And that would be all I'd need to put there. Or if you wanted to put an example, you could do that too. I could just say Smith is my example. That works as well. Again, this part right here, we are going to go over it in more depth at the end of this video. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do with that. So just stick around. All right, but that's the grammar checkup, and it is due by Sunday. The other assignment is listed here in its entirety. It's reading response number 3, due by Sunday. What I would like for you to do is go to the glossy pages in our Discovering Literature textbook, starting on pages 698. Choose 2 image poem combinations. Choose 2 poems that are based off an image, and then answer the questions about them below. So it's kind of like a discussion forum, only it's going to be in the form of a reading response. It's basically the same format like we would do for a discussion forum post, but it's going to be for a reading response assignment. Now, that being said, there's 20 points devoted to this assignment. So, as you can see down here, your answers should be double-spaced, and the answers to all 3 questions should total about a page of information total. If it's not a page, I'm going to deduct a lot of points, because you should be able to, in detail, answer these questions. And if you double-space your answers, getting a minimum of 1 page is not going to be very hard for anyone, I don't think. There's a lot that you can go off of based on those glossy images on page 698. And that's due Sunday as well. So you have 2 assignments this week, and I'm going to talk to you about how to help with one of them at the end of this video. But while we're here, let's talk about poetry. Chapters 16 through 18 are on symbol, words, and form in our Discovering Literature textbook, and I want to go over that next. So if I go to my resources and handouts, and I scroll down to week 8, you'll notice that week 8 and week 9 are both using part 2 of the poetry presentation. We're going to go through the first 7 slides in this week's part, and then we're going to finish up the rest of the slideshow next week in week 9. So I have gone ahead and pulled that up. All right. So Discovering Literature, chapters 16 through 22. Chapter 16 is all about symbolism. And we've talked about symbolism with short story, fiction, and nonfiction, and the idea of things having more meaning than just what's on the surface. So we have a couple of terms that go along with this. One is allegory. An allegory is when a set of symbols work together to create a certain pattern. So a lot of times authors will pick something that kind of connects, symbols that connect. So colors and seasons, for example. If things are red and orange, you might associate it with autumn. If it's white or like ice blue or crystal, you might associate it with winter or gray. If it's spring, you're probably going to associate yellows and bright colors like bright green or pastel pink or lilac. Just using color and imagery as symbolism can work together to create an allegory. And we have more glossy pages that show symbolism with the picture and poem combos on page 762. And I actually like the set of images on 762 almost, if not more, than the first set of glossy images on 698. So I highly suggest looking at both of them. Edward Hopper is featured in the second set, and Nighthawks is one of my favorite paintings. So if you ever go to the Chicago Museum of Art, I highly recommend that you see it. It's a lot smaller than you think it would be. You think it's going to be this big old painting. No, it's really small, but it's pretty cool. But you can see those images on page 762. And that's really the only terminology that we're given for Chapter 16. Chapter 16 really just focuses on poetry that use symbolism. So there's a lot of examples. And so if you have a chance to look that over this week, just kind of see all the poems that are listed there, because there's quite a big selection. Chapter 17 talks about words, in which we're introduced to what our textbook calls the quote-unquote web of language. Poets are sticklers for the right word. We talked about how poetry is the very best of language, and that's exactly true. Poets, if they're doing it right, are going to spend a lot of time drafting and revising and editing their poems to get the right word to come out. They have a keen ear for the emotional quality of words. They understand the difference between connotation and denotation, the direct meaning and the emotional meaning, and oftentimes they work to elaborate on that connotative meaning, that emotional reaction that we have as readers. They have a keen eye for differences in tone. Tone, we've talked about, is the attitude that words create around a piece of literature. So poets can easily establish a tone with their poetry. Is this poem funny, like Dr. Seuss or Shel Silverstein? Or is it more serious, like Rachel McKibbin's or Emily Dickinson? Or is it just really neutral, like Robert Frost? Or trying to think, there's another poet in our textbook that's heavily featured. I know one of the students brought it up yesterday. But yeah, what it was the idea or attitude that the poem is promoting. And then we have archaic language, which is language that is outdated. And I would say that this is probably one of the key reasons that poetry and a lot of literature that is predating the 1700s is very hard to decipher for readers and can be confusing, because language changes over time. If you're an English major, you're going to learn about linguistics, you're going to learn about Old English, Middle New English, and then New English, which is kind of basically the basis of what we're speaking right now. And there's so many ways that language has changed over time. It's really interesting because when you think about math and science, yes, we discover new formulas over time for things, and we discover new items to examine in science, but the math of it stays the same. 1 + 1 is always going to equal 2. With language, though, language is constantly changing and evolving and developing, and it can be frustrating for readers because if you don't understand these changes, then you can be confused by the text. So a lot of Shakespearean works are hard for a modern day audience to read because there's a lot of archaic language in them that if you don't have the context for, you're not going to understand what he's talking about, and the meaning can be lost. Poets also have a keen ear for the sounds of words. Onomatopoeia, we talked about that word in fiction. They are words that sound like they're spelled. It's Dr. Rice on campus, it's his favorite word. That's what he always told our speech team. Onomatopoeia is his favorite word. Poetic diction is a more refined and elegant speech. So poetic diction is a very formal, reflective, sophisticated tone. It's very flowery language. We've talked about it in fiction when we talk about Charles Dickens writing in very flourished, flowery language. Poetic diction is very similar. And then we have the phrase circumlocution. I love this term. Circumlocution is, quote unquote, taking the long way around the meaning of a word. So, for example, I actually had a student, we used to do resume writing in English 121 when I taught 121, and we did resume writing at the end of the semester. And I told students, if you really want to promote yourself on a resume, you can find creative ways to list the things that you do and the tasks that you complete. You can find creative ways to show that on a resume rather than just making it look boring. So I had a student one time that on his resume, he put down that he was an Italian cuisine preparer and transporter. And I thought that was really cool. I'm like, are you working for a catering service? And he's like, no, I'm a pizza delivery guy. There was actually Domino's wrote out beside the text there. And I thought that was so clever. I'm like, well, clearly points for style. You're trying to impress and using language to make the best of your position. So I would give him points for that. If I was an employer and somebody put that down, I'd be like, you're a creative person. You can think on your toes. I like that. But circumlocution is the long way of saying something simple. So, for example, instead of saying your home, you could say your primary residence. Or instead of a pizza delivery guy, you could say an Italian cuisine preparer and transporter. It's just a long, fancy way of saying something very simple. A dialect is how we tell the basic setting of a poem. So unlike short stories and prose, poetry doesn't often have settings. Poetry may just be about a moment in time or an emotion or a reaction. There may not actually be a plot or any setting to the poem. So sometimes, to give it context, a poet will include certain words to give the audience an idea of where it came from. So I want you to try to read the poem on page 795 out loud, and you'll start to notice yourself speaking almost in another accent or dialect. So for example, I've pulled up page 795, and Hugh McDiarmid's Weep and Wail No More is in the middle of the page there, written in 1948. And I'm going to read this poem out loud, but I'm really going to sound out the words, and I want you to notice how my voice, in trying to sound out these words, starts to change its inflection a little bit. I mean, it's not great, but just notice. Stop killin' the dade. Gear hour you weepin' and wailin'. You maun keep quiet. If you want to hear them still, and no blur their image in your mind, for they've only a faint wee whisperin' voice, makin' ne'er mair noise of than the growin' of the grass that flourishes where naebody walks. I love that last line because it's where naebody walks. So where nobody walks, but where naebody walks. It sounds almost like you're speaking in another language, because it is. It's reflective, and the poet has included that dialect in the poem to give you an idea of where that poet's come from. It gives you a setting and a historical context that if they just wrote it out in plain English, you wouldn't have. And I think that's really, really interesting. And if you read a lot of bilingual poetry or poetry from other countries or international works, you're going to find that as well. And I think it's fascinating. My favorite term, I think, out of this entire textbook is this one right here, alliteration. It is repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in the same line. And on page 798, they talk about alliteration, and it's my favorite. So in speech, I was on the speech team here at SIC, and we did a lot of warm-ups and practices, and we do a lot of alliterative phrases. So she sells seashells by the seashore, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, or how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, and she sells seashells by the seashore were probably the two most common that we do to practice and warm up. I always think of Anchorman, the movie where at the very beginning, Will Ferrell's character Ron Burgundy is like, "How now, brown cow? The arsonist was denied a bank loan." I just love those. But the how now, brown cow, there's that same repetitive ow sound. So that's alliteration. Or she sells seashells by the seashore. There's that seesh sound that's alliterative. So if you're having trouble coming up with the title of your paper, I would highly recommend using alliteration, because it's creative and it's fun, and it allows you to play with words and with sounds, and it can create a very snappy, fun title for your papers using alliteration. So I encourage you to do so. Chapter 18 is on rhyme, meter, and stanza, and there are a lot of terms in this chapter. There are so many terms in this chapter that I did not include all of them. Now, don't worry. If they're not on this PowerPoint, they're not going to be on your test. So that's one plus. But there are a lot. Most of them, as you're going to find out just from looking at this PowerPoint, are stylistic choices. So as you're writing paper 2, if you are needing to find words and terminology to describe your methods, the methods behind your madness of analyzing these poems, I would look at chapter 18, because chapter 18 has a lot of terms that you can pick from to describe the various poems that you're looking at. So, for example, end rhyme and internal rhyme. End rhyme is what we normally associate with poetry. It is the very modern, typical use of rhyme, where the last word of the verse rhymes with the next last word. However, if you look at page 807, internal rhyme actually is used often, and that's just where you have words at the beginning, or in the middle rather, that rhyme. So you can kind of see that. Let me pull up page 807. Towards Gwendolyn Brooks's poem Old Mary, towards the bottom of page 807, you can see there that she has some end rhyme there, defense and tense, and know and go. But also, there is towards the next page some examples of some internal rhyming as well. So yeah, internal rhyme is not as common as end rhyme, but it is still an option that you have if you get stuck and you can't find an end rhyme that works. You can find an internal rhyme, I think, a little easier. On page 807, they review meter and stanza, which we've talked about in previous lecture videos. Closed couplets are noted on page 809, along with multiple rhymes. Closed couplets are just two lines that rhyme in a row. Just that's the pattern, is you got two lines that rhyme, two lines that rhyme, two lines that rhyme. That's a closed couplet. So you can kind of see on page 809 there, we've got our example of multiple rhymes, but on page 810, there's an example of closed couplets. Jonathan Swift, that's the poet I was thinking of earlier. Jonathan Swift's A Description of the Morning. You can see the pattern out there to the side on page 810, where the last words of the sentence are, it's an end rhyme. There's coach, approach, AA, flown, own, BB, door, floor, CC, airs, stairs, DD, trace, place, EE, deep, sweep, FF, meet, street, GG, seas, fees, HH, and stand, hands, II. There's two sets of rhymes in a row. That is closed couplets. Multiple rhyme, you turn back a page, we have Bob Dylan's song, It's All Right Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. That song is an example of multiple rhyme, where you have various lines of poetry that rhyme in succession. So I put up here single rhyme, which is where the end rhymes only are one syllable, so moon, soon. Double rhyme is when it's balloon, saloon. And then triple rhyme, a little bit harder, is extrovert, introvert. So on your poetry exam, I'm going to ask you to define multiple rhymes, which the answer is pretty easy. It's on page 809 too. And then I want you to give me some examples of a single, double, and triple rhyme. And this is the format I want you to do. So it should be a pretty easy question, but for some reason students get thrown off by it on the actual exam. So just expect this part here to come back into play on our poetry exam. Assonance is similar to half and slant rhymes. It's more of a distant echo than an actual rhyme. So we talked about slant and half rhymes being where words kind of rhyme, but they don't. Assonance is really where they're barely rhyming. We're really scraping the bottom of the barrel to find a rhyme. So for example, break and fade. Break, fade, kind of rhymes a little bit. Mice, fight. The mice and fight, that I sound is similar, but the last part of the word really doesn't match up. So these are like, you're really towing the line of whether or not it rhymes, and that's assonance. It's just barely there, but it will still count it, but it's not really a rhyme in my opinion. But our textbook says that it's an assonance. It is. Anapest is when you have two unstressed syllables in a foot. So we talked about iambic. And iambic is where you stress the second syllable of a foot in a meter. So if you have to watch the woods fill up with snow, that second word is the one we emphasize. That's iambic. Anapest is when we really don't stress anything. And a lot of open form and free verse poetry that doesn't have a rhyme pattern, you'll find anapest quite frequently. Trochaic is when the stress is on the first syllable instead of the second syllable. And if you look over to, let me find the exact page here, if you go back towards page 817, you're going to see Piercy by Shelley's poem 2, and that poem on page 817 actually has multiple, I think 5 trochaic lines, 2 iambic, and it ends on a trochaic line. So I'm going to look at the last 2 lines of that poem on page 817. So my line in Shelley's poem 2, the first line is iambic, which makes sense. And so, thy thoughts, when thou art gone. It's iambic. That second syllable is getting pushed. But notice the last line. Love it, self shall slumber on. The first part of the line is emphasized instead of the second. It's a very subtle difference, but it's noticeable if you read it out loud. And so that's kind of your difference. So you can use these terms, trochaic and iambic, in your actual poetry discussion, or any of these rather, you can use to help reflect on that. Now, again, like I said, this chapter is chock full of terminology, and I don't have all of it on here because honestly, if I included every single term, I'd probably have about 6 more slides for chapter 18 alone. But I encourage you to please look through chapter 8, see all of the terms that are listed here, because there may be some that you can use to describe your poems in your paper. There's a lot on various types of meter and quatrains, tercets, sestets, octaves. There's so many ways to define your patterns. Dactyl is true unstressed syllables after one stressed one. Blank verse, we see blank verse quite a bit in terms of terminology with poetry. It is when you have unrhymed lines of poetry within a sonnet. Pentameter is 5 stressed syllables within one line of poetry. And again, like I said, these are the 3 that I think I see the most in poetry, but there's a ton in chapter 18. If you look at pages 817 to 820, there's so many terms there that I'm just not going to go over because, again, they're all stylistic choices. They're just options that you have as a writer. Villanelle. A villanelle is a country, folk, or song poem. Country or folk poem / song. Just something folksy or bluegrass. Popular ballads are song-like poems that are a little bit longer than just a lyric. So Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. It's a long song. I would say it's more of a popular ballad than it is a typical song that you might see. And then we have literary ballads, which are lengthy poems that have kind of a question and answer style to them that read a little bit more like prose. And my example would be the Misty Mountain song that the dwarves sing in the original Hobbit, in the book and in the movie. It's a poem, but it's sung with a very long, drawn-out narrative style. And that's pretty much it for this week. We're going to touch base on the remaining chapters of poetry with next week's video. So before I leave this week's Week 8 video, I do have one more thing that I want to talk with you all about. And that is next week, which is Week 9. Week 9, you're going to have your paper due along with our poetry exam. So between now, Week 8, and next week, I am going to be putting out one more video. The video I'm going to create during the week is going to be specifically about MLA. I didn't want to put it on the end of this video because I want the MLA video to be its own separate thing that you can go back and watch over and over again if you have any trouble with citations. So I'm going to put this video down here in our announcements, and then sometime in the middle of this week, expect that there's also going to be a MLA citation presentation video as well. So you should see Week 8 listed here, and then the MLA video as well. So please do me a favor and watch that MLA video. It is going to cover a lot, but we are going to be required to cite our textbook in this paper too. Some of you may be citing more if you're using poems that aren't in our book or pictures that you didn't take yourself. So please watch that video. And we're going to use that MLA video constantly as a reference between now and the end of the semester. So if you didn't use MLA for paper 1, y'all got off the hook. But now we're going to start talking about MLA. And I'm actually excited because I don't think MLA is hard as long as you know what to do and you practice it. And that is what the video I'm going to post here in our announcements this week is going to talk about. So, as always, if you have questions, please let me know. I am looking forward to reading your work this week. And if you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, happy midterm. And I look forward to talking to you all again very soon with our MLA video later this week. Bye.